Hello listeners, this is Lindsay, and I am here today with Anthony and Laura. We are all Peace Corps volunteers in Bosniak communities in Kosovo. Laura is about to have her close of service, which means that she has completed 2 years of service in Peace Corps, and Anthony and I have both reached our 1-year anniversary in country. We are all serving in small villages in the Jupa Valley in eastern Kosovo. I guess before I get a little bit further, I'm going to read a little bit about Bosniaks in Kosovo to give some statistics. The largest ethnic group in Kosovo is Albanian. Bosniaks are an ethnic minority, just like Roma, Serbians, Ashkali, and Egyptians. In the 2011 census, it was reported that there were just under 28,000 Bosniaks in Kosovo. And to give you some perspective, the population of the entire country of Kosovo is just 1.8 million people. So it's a pretty small group of people. Bosniaks are located in eastern Kosovo, but there's also communities in western Kosovo and the Pea region. Bosniaks speak a dialect of Serbian. In the Jupa Valley, they call the language Nashinski, and it essentially is the Serbian language. The Bosniaks do learn Albanian in school. From my experience, Albanian is not spoken very well by a lot of my community, at least. Tell me about the language that's spoken in the Bosniak communities of the Jupa Valley. How are you learning it? And then when you're ready, just speak a little bit of it.
So the dialect, as Lindsay was saying, is called Nashinski, which in their dialect means our language or our Serbian. So basically it's a preserved mountain language that was from the continuum of the South Slavic languages, Bulgarian, Macedonian, Serbian, sort of Croatian before when it was Yugoslavia. And where we're at, it's basically a mixture of all these languages, and it in itself was able to preserve the old Serbian in a sense. My counterpart was telling me recently that the sounds of the standardized Serbian, which wasn't standardized until the late 1800s. In the dialect, they have sounds that aren't in standard, and in the standard they have sounds that aren't in dialect. So I guess an example, I can try this, is for Nashinski is Ja sam u grad uz Laura I Lindsay, which means I am in the city with Lindsay and Laura. But in standard Serbian you would say Ja sam u gradu sa Lindsayom I sa Laurom. So again, there's a difference between the two, and you have to follow the rules of the language. An interesting, a big component of it is the cases. So basically the prepositions and what you're trying to say changes the endings of the adjectives, nouns, most words I would say. So you have to follow that for the standard. However, when you go to the dialect, they drop out most of them. So you can just keep it as a regular word. You don't have to change the endings. And the thing is with their dialect, they understand the standard and can get by with it, and in Macedonian. However, the standard Serbian speakers, when they hear it, do not understand them, and it will take them a few months.
I have heard this too, that whenever I tell people about Nashinski, that they tell me that if they don't live in the Jupa Valley with the Bosniaks, they say they have a difficult time understanding Nashinski. For the most part, they can understand it though. Laura, how about you? How has it been learning Nashinski for you, and what has your experience been with the language?
I agree with Anthony's answer. He did a great job demonstrating a difference between Nashinski and Standard Serbian. In my experience, I've been able to function for the most part learning and using Standard Serbian. People in my village do watch Serbian TV channels and are educated in Standard Bosnian or Serbian at school, so they're certainly able to communicate, but as I've lived in the village for 2 years, I have been able to recognize what words are different in Nashinski and at least recognize, if not use, dialect words. So it's been very fascinating for me. And as a Peace Corps Kosovo volunteer, we've had a lot of opportunities to travel to Macedonia, as we have a regional medical unit there. So I've often seen the similarities between Nashinsky dialect words and Macedonian, because a lot of times those words come from Macedonian or are from the same Slavic root. So that's been very fascinating as well. I feel like we have an advantage as Bosniak volunteers to have some exposure to Macedonian words as well.
Mm-hmm. And I've noticed that, at least in my community, people get quite a thrill when they know that you're learning the language. It seems like every time I get on my combi, a combi, by the way, is a little minivan that transports us to the city. Whenever I get on the combi and I encounter a new villager that hasn't seen me before, and I just even say something as simple as, "Hello, how are you doing?" They light up and they're like, "Oh, she's learning Nashinsky." They really, really appreciate us, learning the language, and I think that they probably, I can't speak for the people that, are in my community, but I get the sense that there's a sense of pride and happiness that somebody, from outside their community has come in and is taking on something that's very close to them and very cultural for them.
And to add on, it does show again that you're part of a family because you're learning this dialect that is specific to this region. So how else would you learn it besides having a family to teach you and that you're integrating?
Mm-hmm. Exactly. And they always sort of chuckle, not laugh, but just sort of chuckle and smile, and they're so happy. What you said, Anthony, actually leads directly into my next question, but I'm going to start with Laura. So Laura, tell me a little bit about your host family, and do you feel that living with a host family has helped you integrate into the community?
I live with a mother, a host father who actually spends most of the time living and working in Montenegro, a grandfather, and 3 children. And I feel like I have a really great relationship with them, and that it has helped me a lot with integration. As Anthony referenced earlier, it's very unusual for this community to have a lot of interactions with foreigners. It's not the same as the cities of Kosovo, which have seen a lot of international organizations and visitors and intervention in the last couple of decades. So just having a family that you're attached to, I think, is essential to be understood in this village. And it gives me a role and a place in people's minds, because the concept of an American living by choice in this village and working at the school is kind of a hard concept for them to grasp sometimes. And I have especially learned a lot through my host siblings. I've been able to help them learn some English and learn about different cultures and parts of the world, and they have taught me Nashinsky and been kind of my gateway to participating in things in the village. I go on walks with the children and we're joined by their friends, and it really shows the other villagers that I'm accepted in the community, that I have a role there, and that I'm loved by the students, I hope. And I know that the whole community appreciates that I speak to kids on the street and am always very open to having conversations in either language and perhaps getting a coffee with people. So I do believe that the host family is a very integral part of our experience, for sure.
And Anthony, I know that you're very close with your host family. Tell me a little bit about your host family and how you feel that they've assisted with your integration into your community.
So for me, I live with a mom and dad, their 2 teenage sons, and the host grandma, and then we have a host grandpa who lives in Skopje alone in an apartment. For my integration, again, my host family was the reason why as to how I was able to integrate. Again, I'll always be the American. However, the concept of being able to be seen at social gatherings or go to the local theater that the kids are having go on is detriment. I mean, very much needed for my integration.
I know that my host mom, she told me that she told everyone that to basically treat me like her daughter, and I think that the community sees me so like closely tied now with my host family that when they expect to see me working in the restaurant that they run, they they ask me sometimes questions that I don't even know the answers of, like how people are doing in other countries. And I think that for me too, living with a host family has really helped the community to embrace me as a stranger and somebody that they didn't know before. Anthony, I think we may have covered this a little bit already, but what it's like living in a Bosniak community and how that enhances your experience as a volunteer in an Albanian majority country. Who wants to go first?
To answer the first part of the question, just about living in a non-majority community in Kosovo generally, I have noticed a disconnect or lack of knowledge about the Bosniak community, not only among volunteers and foreigners, but also natives in Kosovo. I've had conversations with people from the Albanian and Serbian communities who are unsure about the origin of the Bosniaks of our region, or have questions about who they are, or just are kind of unaware of their existence in the mountains. And so it's been really rewarding for me to be able to represent this community to the degree that I can, of course, emphasizing that I'm an outsider there, even to other communities within Kosovo. And I know that some people within Kosovo aren't even really aware of the meaning of the stars on the Kosovar flag, which represents 6 major ethnic groups in Kosovo: Albanian, Serbian, Bosniak, Gorani, Roma, Ashkali, Egyptian, and Turkish. So it's kind of a gateway to engage in meaningful conversation with everyone in Kosovo, but I have been surprised by a lack of knowledge, as Bosniak communities are not generally a part of the known narrative of life in Kosovo. And to foreigners, they're likely to only be aware of Albanian and Serbian ethnicities here, but actually this is a very multicultural region and country, and that's not the case.
So I would say that it enabled me to open my eyes that basically every situation or combination that you could think of is in Kosovo when it comes to ethnicity and religion, in a sense. So obviously the Albanians would typically be seen as Muslim. However, you do have those ones that are Christian, and then you have the Serbians who are Orthodox Christians. However, you have where we live, Slavic people, however, they're Muslim. So there's always this, it's never a clear set example for a Serb-speaking person, because it could be a Bosniak who just knows Serbian very well and is actually Muslim. And oftentimes we do have to explain to volunteers, because I'll say, oh, in my community, I'll say an example about food, and then they would just like cut me off and say, wait, do you eat bacon? And I have to say, no, I live in a Muslim family that refuses to eat pig, pork, and having to explain that there are Slavic Serbian speakers who are Muslim and are not this cookie cutter example of Serbians in Kosovo. Though, as for if I feel a disconnect with other Peace Corps volunteers, I would say yes and no. in the sense that they understand that it's very different for us to live in a community that speaks Serbian and it has its own set of rules compared to how the Albanians are, or even the Serbian volunteers. I will say it is difficult sometimes to have to go to the city where everybody speaks Albanian, and if you use your Serbian, it doesn't really get you that far unless the person's over 40, and then you have to figure out the communication with English typically, which oftentimes volunteers can speak in Albanian, and I will have to stare. I just sit there and have to ask them later, what did you guys say? Because I can't even order in Albanian.
Yeah. So, being on public transportation in Kosovo or just going anywhere, the Albanian language, I only know a very few words like Falamandershum and Mirdita, but we don't actually get that, that exposure when you're just walking around and seeing the language that we're hearing and learning and speaking in our communities. We don't get to see it on billboards or just like on menus and cafes and things like that. We may see it a little bit on television, but we don't get that sort of constant exposure. And I didn't notice that maybe until more into my first year and having to go to, as we said, North Macedonia for a medical appointment. I noticed, even though they use Cyrillic and in Bosniak communities they use Latinica, but I noticed that it does make a difference when you can actually hear the language, I think, every day, anywhere you go. I wanted to ask one quick question about culture. I know that maybe some people are familiar with the traditional face painting that's done in Bosniak communities, because there was a very famous National Geographic cover story, I believe, about this. Laura, I think you know maybe a little bit more about this than Anthony and I do. I don't think any of us have ever actually seen it in person, but we know people who have done it, or people in our community that have been this very traditional Bosniak bride with the traditional face painting. Can you tell me a little bit about that?
Yes, unfortunately I haven't seen it in person, but the traditional face painting is practiced in my village. I hope that maybe this summer I'll be able to see a wedding where I can witness it, but there's only a few artists who really are practiced and understand how to do this, so I hope that it's a cultural tradition that will continue and be taught to the younger generations. But I have brought many people, both Americans and other foreign visitors, back to my village just to visit. And one of the things my host mother loves to do is to show pictures of herself from her wedding with the traditional face paint. She recognizes that this is something very unique to their culture, and it's something that foreigners have asked about before and are often very interested in. So it's just a nice opportunity to give us something to share between cultures, and it is very unique, so I urge people to look up Bosniak face painting if you're interested in seeing it.
Do y'all know if there's a special name for it, or is it just Bosniak face painting?
I don't know of a name for it.
I'm sure they have a saying, but we do not know it.
But that's another question we have when we get back.
It's something like whitening. I've heard it before.
Okay. Interesting. I guess even if you Googled that, you probably wouldn't come up with it, because I've tried Googling Nashinsky and there are very few Google hits on Nashinsky. Let's see. Is there anything that we haven't covered yet that you would like to mention about your experience at site?
I'm very grateful for this experience because I recognize that this is not a side of Kosovo that I would see as a traveler or even as an international living in the capital of Pristina. It's a more isolated community that's both geographically isolated because of the mountain region and socially isolated because of the language and ethnic cultural differences. But I think it's very incredible. I love living within the Shar Mountains National Park and getting to see another side of Kosovo with different cultural practices and a unique dialect. And I feel like I've had a very well-balanced Peace Corps service, as well as being able to interact with other ethnic groups of Kosovo as well.
I guess I want to talk about food.
Yeah, go for it.
So, I have noticed that the food between Albanians and Bosniaks is very similar. I do not know how much they interact with each other, but I've had multiple occasions where my host families will say to me, "This is a specialty to this region," and it turns out I've had it before at my Albanian site for training. So it's very unusual. I mean, it's interesting because there's no real because they speak different languages. There's no real integration between the two. We live in the mountains and everybody else is doing their own thing.
Mm-hmm. Like one example, I guess, of Nashinski is that everywhere in Kosovo you get burek, and burek is a really common dish in the Balkans. But in the Zhupa Valley communities, they call it klopita, Klopita. And it's the same thing as burek, but they really like to say, "Oh, it's klopita."
Everybody makes it in Kosovo.
Yeah. And have you seen it made before?
I have.
Have you seen it made before?
Many times.
Okay.
One cultural difference that I encounter a lot is about the role of exercising in this culture. In the U.S., I was a marathon runner. I used to go out and just run in the woods a lot and be very active. And that's something I can't do to the extent that I want in these communities. And it's not something that's very usual to exercise to the extent that I'm used to. So I have a story once of running in a local gym on a treadmill. Nothing very serious, just about 20 minutes, and the female gym owner kept coming over and checking on me to make sure I was okay. Maybe I was sweating more than she was comfortable with. And then when I finished, which was actually probably earlier than I would have otherwise, I was concerned about her concern. She comes to me with a plate of 6 pieces of baklava, asking me to eat because I think she was worried about my health. So that's just an example of a different cultural norm that I think is common here, at least among villagers, and when they're not used to seeing big gyms and the way that internationals like to exercise, I suppose.
I have a story that maybe speaks a lot to the friendliness of the Bosniak community. When I first got to my site, I'm the first volunteer in my site, and I had to learn the combi schedule all on my own. And my family isn't even that familiar with the combi schedule. And so I didn't actually know where the combis were or where they picked up or what schedule they ran on. So I was in a little bit of a panic one day, and I waved down a van that I thought was the combi to my village. But as soon as I got in the van, I realized that it wasn't my combi. It was full of Bosniak women in dimier pants, and it was full of bread, and there were no seats. And I knew enough of the language to say, I'm going to my site, and they were like, "Oh, okay, we're going to Jablanica," which is not my site. It's another Bosniak village, and I knew that it was along the way, so I said okay. And so we drive up the mountain in this van full of bread, and everyone in the van is trying to talk to me and find out who I am and what am I doing living in my village, because they know that I'm American. When they dropped me off, I tried to pay them the rate that I normally pay my combi, and they were like, no, it's okay, nema veze, never mind, like, it's fine. And I just thought it was very sweet that they just let somebody flag down their bread van and get a ride with them. So I think that wraps it up for us. I want to say thank you to Anthony and Laura for sharing your experiences in the Bosniak communities, and I want to thank the listeners for listening and learning a little bit more about this really special and unique community in Kosovo. So, vidimo se, ciao.
Ciao.
Ciao, thank you.
Bye, guys.